friends, I'm Ellie. Welcome to Cardboard Design. Today, let's listen to meaningful fairy tales. You will learn valuable lessons from these stories. The first fairy tale, Simeli Mountain. There were once two brothers, the one rich, the other poor. The rich one, however, gave nothing to the poor one, and he gained a scanty living by trading in corn, and often did so badly that he had no bread for his wife and children. Once when he was wheeling a barrow through the forest, he saw, on one side of him, a great, bare, naked-looking mountain, and as he had never seen it before, he stood still and stared at it with amazement. While he was thus standing, he saw 12 great, wild men coming towards him, and as he believed they were robbers, he pushed his barrow into the thicket, climbed up a tree, and waited to see what would happen. The 12 men, however, went to the mountain and cried,
Semsi Mountain, open!
And immediately the barren mountain opened down the middle, and the 12 went into it, and as soon as they were within, it shut. After a short time, however, it opened again, and the men came forth carrying heavy sacks on their shoulders, and when they were all once more in the daylight, they said,
Semsi Mountain, shut thyself!
Then the mountain closed together, and there was no longer any entrance to be seen to it, and the 12 went away. When they were quite out of sight, the poor man got down from the tree, and was curious to know what really was secretly hidden in the mountain. So he went up to it and said,
Semsi Mountain, open!
And the mountain opened to him also. Then he went inside, and the whole mountain was a cavern full of silver and gold, and behind lay great piles of pearls and sparkling jewels, heaped up like corn. The poor man hardly knew what to do, and whether he might take any of these treasures for himself or not, but at last he filled his pockets with gold, but he left the pearls and precious stones where they were. When he came out again, he also said,
Semsi Mountain, shut thyself!
And the mountain closed itself, and he went home with his barrow. And now he had no more cause for anxiety, but could buy bread for his wife and children with his gold, and wine into the bargain. He lived joyously and uprightly, gave help to the poor, and did good to everyone. When, however, the money came to an end, he went to his brother, borrowed a measure that held a bushel, and brought himself some more, but did not touch any of the most valuable things. When for the third time he wanted to fetch something, he again borrowed the measure of his brother. The rich man had, however, long been envious of his brother's possessions, and of the handsome way of living which he had set on foot, and could not understand from whence the riches came, and what his brother wanted with the measure. Then he thought of a cunning trick, and covered the bottom of the measure with pitch, and when he got the measure back, a piece of money was sticking in it. He at once went to his brother and asked him,
What hast thou been measuring in the bushel measure?
Corn and barley,
said the other. Then he showed him the piece of money, and threatened that if he did not tell the truth, he would accuse him before a court of justice. The poor man then told him everything just as it happened. The rich man, however, ordered his carriage to be made ready, and drove away, resolved to use the opportunity better than his brother had done, and to bring back with him quite different treasures. When he came to the mountain, he cried,
Semsi Mountain, open!
The mountain opened, and he went inside it. There lay the treasures all before him, and for a long time he did not know which to clutch at first. At length he loaded himself with as many precious stones as he could carry. He wished to carry his burden outside, but, as his heart and soul were entirely full of the treasures, he had forgotten the name of the mountain, and cried,
Simeli Mountain, open!
That, however, was not the right name, and the mountain never stirred but remained shut. Then he was alarmed, but the longer he thought about it, the more his thoughts confused themselves, and his treasures were no more of any use to him. In the evening the mountain opened, and the 12 robbers came in, and when they saw him they laughed and cried out,
Bird, have we caught thee at last? Didst thou think we had never noticed that thou hadst been in here twice? We could not catch thee then. This third time thou shalt not get out again.
Then he cried,
It was not I, it was my brother.
But let him beg for his life and say what he would. They cut his head off. A cautionary lesson about greed and avarice, as the elder brother pays a high price for coveting his younger brother's possessions. The elder brother forgets the correct name of the mountain and opens a different door. illustrating a lesson in cautiousness and prudence when faced with opportunities and risks. The actions of the elder brother lead to just consequences as he faces pursuit and punishment from the robbers. The second fairy tale, The Donkey. Once on a time there lived a king and a queen, who were rich and had everything they wanted but no children. The queen lamented over this day and night and said,
I am like a field on which nothing grows.
At last God gave her her wish, but when the child came into the world, it did not look like a human child, but was a little donkey. When the mother saw that, her lamentations and outcries began in real earnest. She said she would far rather have had no child at all than have a donkey, and that they were to throw it into the water that the fishes might devour it. But the king said,
No, since God has sent him, he shall be my son and heir, and after my death sit on the royal throne and wear the kingly crown.
The donkey, therefore, was brought up and grew bigger, and his ears grew up beautifully high and straight. He was, however, of a merry disposition, jumped about, played, and had a special pleasure in music, so that he went to a celebrated musician and said,
Teach me thine art, that I may play the lute as well as thou dost.
Oh, dear little master,
answered the musician.
that would come very hard to you. Your fingers are certainly not suited to it, and are far too big. I am afraid the strings would not last.
No excuses were of any use. The donkey was determined to play the lute. He was persevering and industrious, and at last learned to do it as well as the master himself. The young lordling once went out walking full of thought and came to a well. He looked into it, and in the mirror clear water saw his donkey's form. He was so distressed about it, that he went out into the wide world and only took with him one faithful companion. They traveled up and down, and at last they came into a kingdom where an old king reigned who had an only but wonderfully beautiful daughter. The donkey said,
Here we will stay.
knocked at the gate, and cried,
A guest is without open, that he may enter.
As, however, the gate was not opened. He sat down, took his lute and played it in the most delightful manner with his 2 forefeet. Then the doorkeeper opened his eyes most wonderfully wide, and ran to the king and said,
Outside by the gate sits a young donkey which plays the lute as well as an experienced master.
Then let the musician come to me.
said the king. When, however, a donkey came in, everyone began to laugh at the lute player. And now the donkey was asked to sit down and eat with the servants. He, however, was unwilling, and said,
I am no common stable ass. I am a noble one.
Then they said,
If that is what thou art, seat thyself with the men of war.
No,
said he.
I will sit by the king.
The king smiled, and said good-humoredly,
Yes, it shall be as thou wilt. Little ass, come here to me.
Then he asked.
Little ass, how does my daughter please thee?
The donkey turned his head towards her, looked at her, nodded, and said,
I like her above measure. I have never yet seen anyone so beautiful as she is.
Well, then thou shalt sit next her too.
said the king.
That is exactly what I wish.
Said the donkey, and he placed himself by her side, ate and drank, and knew how to behave himself daintily and cleanly. When the noble beast had stayed a long time at the king's court, he thought,
What good does all this do me? I shall still have to go home again.
let his head hang sadly, and went to the king and asked for his dismissal. But the king had grown fond of him, and said,
Little ass, what ails thee? Thou lookest as sour as a jug of vinegar. I will give thee what thou wantest. Dost thou want gold?
No,
said the donkey, and shook his head.
Dost thou want jewels and rich dress?
no,
Dost thou wish for half my kingdom?
indeed, no.
Then said the king, If I did but know what would make me content.
Wilt thou have my pretty daughter to wife?
Yes,
Said the ass.
I should indeed like her.
And all at once he became quite merry and full of happiness, for that was exactly what he was wishing for. So a great and splendid wedding was held. In the evening, when the bride and bridegroom were led into their bedroom, the king wanted to know if the ass would behave well, and ordered a servant to hide himself there. When they were both within, the bridegroom bolted the door, looked around, and as he believed that they were quite alone, he suddenly threw off his ass's skin. and stood there in the form of a handsome royal youth.
Now,
Said he,
thou seest who I am, and seest also that I am not unworthy of thee.
then the bride was glad, and kissed him, and loved him dearly. When morning came, he jumped up, put his animal's skin on again, and no one could have guessed what kind of a form was hidden beneath it. Soon came the old king.
Ah,
Cried he,
is the little ass merry? But surely thou art sad,
said he to his daughter.
that thou hast not got a proper man for thy husband.
Oh, no, dear father, I love him as well as if he were the handsomest in the world, and I will keep him as long as I live.
The king was surprised, but the servant who had concealed himself came and revealed everything to him. The king said,
That cannot be true.
Then watch yourself the next night, and you will see it with your own eyes. And hark you, Lord King, if you were to take his skin away and throw it in the fire, he would be forced to show himself in his true shape.
Thy advice is good.
said the king. And at night when they were asleep, he stole in. And when he got to the bed, he saw by the light of the moon a noble-looking youth lying there, and the skin lay stretched on the ground. So he took it away, and had a great fire lighted outside, and threw the skin into it, and remained by it himself until it was all burnt to ashes. As, however, he was anxious to know how the robbed man would behave himself, he stayed awake the whole night and watched. When the youth had slept his sleep out, he got up by the first light of morning, and wanted to put on the ass's skin, but it was not to be found. On this he was alarmed, and full of grief and anxiety said,
Now I shall have to contrive to escape.
but when he went out, there stood the king, who said,
My son, whither away in such haste? What hast thou in mind? Stay here. Thou art such a handsome man, thou shalt not go away from me. I will now give thee half my kingdom, and after my death thou shalt have the whole of it.
Then I hope that what begins so well may end well, and I will stay with you.
said the youth. And the old man gave him half the kingdom. And in a year's time, when he died, the youth had the whole, and after the death of his father he had another kingdom as well, and lived in all magnificence. The story highlights the innate value and true nature of individuals, not depending on outward appearances or social status. The love between the stable boy and the princess is not contingent on physical appearance, but is based on the heart and soul. Love can create miracles, transform destinies, and overcome barriers, even differences in social status. The third fairy tale, Strong Hans. There were once a man and a woman who had an only child, and lived quite alone in a solitary valley. It came to pass that the mother once went into the wood to gather branches of fir, and took with her little Hans, who was just 2 years old. As it was springtime, and the child took pleasure in the many-colored flowers, she went still further onwards with him into the forest. Suddenly 2 robbers sprang out of the thicket, seized the mother and child, and carried them far away into the black forest, where no one ever came from one year's end to another. The poor woman urgently begged the robbers to set her and her child free, but their hearts were made of stone. They would not listen to her prayers and entreaties, and drove her on farther by force. After they had worked their way through bushes and briars for about 2 miles, they came to a rock where there was a door, at which the robbers knocked and it opened at once. They had to go through a long dark passage, and at last came into a great cavern, which was lighted by a fire which burnt on the hearth. On the wall hung swords, sabers, and other deadly weapons which gleamed in the light, and in the midst stood a black table at which 4 other robbers were sitting gambling, and the captain sat at the head of it. As soon as he saw the woman he came and spoke to her, and told her to be at ease and have no fear. They would do nothing to hurt her, but she must look after the housekeeping, and if she kept everything in order, she should not fare ill with them. Thereupon they gave her something to eat, and showed her a bed where she might sleep with her child. The woman stayed many years with the robbers, and Hans grew tall and strong. His mother told him stories, and taught him to read an old book of tales about knights which she found in the cave. When Hans was 9 years old, he made himself a strong club out of a branch of fir, hid it behind the bed, and then went to his mother and said,
Dear mother, pray tell me who is my father. I must and will know.
His mother was silent and would not tell him. that he might not become homesick. Moreover, she knew that the godless robbers would not let him go away, but it almost broke her heart that Hans should not go to his father. In the night, when the robbers came home from their robbing expedition, Hans brought out his club, stood before the captain, and said,
I now wish to know who is my father, and if thou dost not at once tell me, I will strike thee down.
Then the captain laughed, and gave Hans such a box on the ear that he rolled under the table. Hans got up again, held his tongue, and thought,
I will wait another year and then try again. Perhaps I shall do better then.
When the year was over, he brought out his club again, rubbed the dust off it, looked at it well, and said,
It is a stout, strong club.
At night the robbers came home, drank one jug of wine after another, and their heads began to be heavy. Then Hans brought out his club, placed himself before the captain, and asked him who was his father. But the captain again gave him such a vigorous box on the ear that Hans rolled under the table, but it was not long before he was up again, and beat the captain and the robbers so with his club, that they could no longer move either their arms or their legs. His mother stood in a corner full of admiration of his bravery and strength. When Hans had done his work, he went to his mother and said,
Now I have shown myself to be in earnest, but now I must also know who is my father.
Dear Hans,
answered the mother,
come, we will go and seek him until we find him.
She took from the captain the key to the entrance door, and Hans fetched a great meal sack and packed into it gold and silver, and whatsoever else he could find that was beautiful, until it was full, and then he took it on his back. They left the cave, but how Hans did open his eyes when he came out of the darkness into daylight, and saw the green forest, and the flowers, and the birds, and the morning sun and the sky. He stood there and wondered at everything just as if he had not been very wise. His mother looked for the way home, and when they had walked for a couple of hours, they got safely into their lonely valley and to their little house. The father was sitting in the doorway. He wept for joy when he recognized his wife and heard that Hans was his son, for he had long regarded them both as dead. But Hans, although he was not 12 years old, was a head taller than his father. They went into the little room together, but Hans had scarcely put his sack on the bench by the stove. Then the whole house began to crack, the bench broke down, and then the floor, and the heavy sack fell through into the cellar.
God save us!
Cried the father.
What's that? Now thou hast broken our little house to pieces.
Don't grow any gray hairs about that, dear father.
Answered Hans.
There, in that sack, is more than is wanting for a new house.
The father and Hans at once began to build a new house, to buy cattle and land, and to keep a farm. Hans plowed the fields, and when he followed the plow and pushed it into the ground, the bullocks had scarcely any need to draw. The next spring, Hans said,
Keep all the money and get a walking stick that weighs 100 weight made for me that I may go a-traveling.
When the wished for stick was ready, he left his father's house, went forth, and came to a deep, dark forest. There he heard something crunching and cracking, looked round, and saw a fir tree which was wound round like a rope from the bottom to the top. And when he looked upwards, he saw a great fellow who had laid hold of the tree and was twisting it like a willow wand.
Hello,
Cried Hans.
what art thou doing up there? The fellow replied,
I got some faggots together yesterday, and am twisting a rope for them.
That is what I like.
Thought Hans.
He has some strength.
And he called to him.
Leave that alone, and come with me.
The fellow came down, and he was taller by a whole head than Hans, and Hans was not little.
Thy name is now for Twister.
Said Hans to him. Thereupon they went further and heard something knocking and hammering with such force that the ground shook at every stroke. Shortly afterwards they came to a mighty rock, before which a giant was standing and striking great pieces of it away with his fist. When Hans asked what he was about, he answered,
At night, when I want to sleep, bears, wolves, and other vermin of that kind come, which sniff and snuffle about me and won't let me rest. So I want to build myself a house and lay myself inside it, so that I may have some peace.
Oh, indeed.
Thought Hans,
I can make use of this one also.
and said to him,
Leave thy house building alone, and go with me. Thou shalt be called Rock Splitter.
The man consented. and they all three roamed through the forest. And wherever they went, the wild beasts were terrified and ran away from them. In the evening, they came to an old deserted castle, went up into it, and laid themselves down in the hall to sleep. The next morning, Hans went into the garden. It had run quite wild and was full of thorns and bushes. And as he was thus walking round about, a wild boar rushed at him. He, however, gave it such a blow with his club that it fell directly. He took it on his shoulders and carried it in, and they put it on a spit, roasted it, and enjoyed themselves. Then they arranged that each day, in turn, 2 should go out hunting, and 1 should stay at home, and cook 9 pounds of meat for each of them. For Twister stayed at home the first, and Hans and Rock Splitter went out hunting. When For Twister was busy cooking, a little shriveled up old mannequin came to him in the castle, and asked for some meat.
Be off, sly hypocrite.
He answered,
Thou needest no meat.
but how astonished For Twister was when the little insignificant dwarf sprang up at him, and belabored him so with his fists that he could not defend himself but fell on the ground and gasped for breath. The dwarf did not go away until he had thoroughly vented his anger on him. When the 2 others came home from hunting, For Twister said nothing to them of the old mannequin and of the blows which he himself had received, and thought,
When they stay at home, they may just try their chance with a little scrubbing brush.
and the mere thought of that gave him pleasure already. The next day, Rock Splitter stayed at home, and he fared just as For Twister had done. He was very ill treated by the dwarf because he was not willing to give him any meat. When the others came home in the evening, For Twister easily saw what he had suffered, but both kept silence and thought.
Hans also must taste some of that soup.
Hans, who had to stay at home the next day, did his work in the kitchen as it had to be done, and as he was standing skimming the pan, the dwarf came, and without more ado demanded a bit of meat. Then Hans thought,
He is a poor wretch. I will give him some of my share, that the others may not run short.
and handed him a bit. When the dwarf had devoured it, he again asked for some meat, and good-natured Hans gave it to him, and told him it was a handsome piece, and that he was to be content with it. But the dwarf begged again for the 3rd time.
Thou art shameless.
Said Hans, and gave him none. Then the malicious dwarf wanted to spring on him and treat him as he had treated For Twister and Rock Splitter, but he had got to the wrong man. Hans, without exerting himself much, gave him a couple of blows which made him jump down the castle steps. Hans was about to run after him, but fell right over him, for he was so tall. When he rose up again, the dwarf had got the start of him. Hans hurried after him as far as the forest, and saw him slip into a hole in the rock. Hans now went home, but he had marked the spot. When the 2 others came back, they were surprised that Hans was so well. He told them what had happened, and then they no longer concealed how it had fared with them. Hans laughed and said,
It served you quite right. Why were you so greedy with your meat? It is a disgrace that you who are so big should have let yourselves be beaten by the dwarf.
Thereupon they took a basket and a rope, and all 3 went to the hole in the rock into which the dwarf had slipped, and let Hans and his club down in the basket. When Hans had reached the bottom, he found a door, and when he opened it, a maiden was sitting there who was lovely as any picture, nay, so beautiful that no words can express it, and by her side sat the dwarf and grinned at Hans like a sea cat. She, however, was bound with chains, and looked so mournfully at him that Hans felt great pity for her, and thought to himself,
Thou must deliver her out of the power of the wicked dwarf.
and gave him such a blow with his club that he fell down dead. Immediately the chains fell from the maiden, and Hans was enraptured with her beauty. She told him she was a king's daughter whom a savage count had stolen away from her home, and imprisoned there among the rocks, because she would have nothing to say to him. The count had, however, set the dwarf as a watchman, and he had made her bear misery and vexation enough. And now Hans placed the maiden in the basket and had her drawn up. The basket came down again, but Hans did not trust his 2 companions, and thought,
They have already shown themselves to be false, and told me nothing about the dwarf. Who knows what design they may have against me?
So he put his club in the basket, and it was lucky he did, for when the basket was halfway up, they let it fall again, and if Hans had really been sitting in it, he would have been killed. But now he did not know how he was to work his way out of the depths, and when he turned it over and over in his mind, he found no counsel.
It is indeed sad.
Said he to himself,
that I have to waste away down here.
And as he was thus walking backwards and forwards, he once more came to the little chamber where the maiden had been sitting, and saw that the dwarf had a ring on his finger which shone and sparkled. Then he drew it off and put it on, and when he turned it round on his finger, he suddenly heard something rustle over his head. He looked up and saw spirits of the air hovering above, who told him he was their master, and asked what his desire might be. Hans was at first struck dumb, but afterwards he said that they were to carry him above again. They obeyed instantly, and it was just as if he had flown up himself. When, however, he was above again, he found no one in sight, for Twister and Rock Splitter had hurried away, and had taken the beautiful maiden with them. But Hans turned the ring, and the spirits of the air came and told him that the two were on the sea. Hans ran and ran without stopping until he came to the seashore, and there far, far out on the water, he perceived a little boat in which his faithless comrades were sitting, and in fierce anger he leapt, without thinking what he was doing, club in hand into the water, and began to swim. But the club, which weighed 100 weight, dragged him deep down until he was all but drowned. Then in the very nick of time he turned his ring, and immediately the spirits of the air came and bore him as swift as lightning into the boat. He swung his club and gave his wicked comrades the reward they merited and threw them into the water. And then he sailed with the beautiful maiden, who had been in the greatest alarm, and whom he delivered for the second time home to her father and mother, and married her. And all rejoiced exceedingly. Starting with the abduction of the mother and Hans, the mother-child bond and forgiveness between them stand out. The mother tries to protect Hans and keeps the family bond strong even in difficult circumstances. Hans fearlessly confronts challenges and dangers to protect his mother and rescue the princess. His courage and determination help him overcome all difficulties. In contrast to deceivers, Hans remains honest and sincere. This not only helps him defeat the evildoers, but also wins the heart of the princess. The fourth fairy tale, The Shepherd Boy. There was once on a time a shepherd boy whose fame spread far and wide because of the wise answers which he gave to every question. The king of the country heard of it likewise, but did not believe it, and sent for the boy. Then he said to him,
If thou canst give me an answer to 3 questions, which I will ask thee, I will look on thee as my own child, and thou shalt dwell with me in my royal palace.
The boy said,
What are the 3 questions?
The king said,
The first is, how many drops of water are there in the ocean?
The shepherd boy answered,
Lord King, if you will have all the rivers on earth dammed up so that not a single drop runs from them into the sea until I have counted it, I will tell you how many drops there are in the sea.
The king said,
The next question is, how many stars are there in the sky?
The shepherd boy said,
Give me a great sheet of white paper.
And then he made so many fine points on it with a pen that they could scarcely be seen, and it was all but impossible to count them. Anyone who looked at them would have lost his sight. Then he said,
There are as many stars in the sky as there are points on the paper. Just count them.
But no one was able to do it. The king said,
The third question is, how many seconds of time are there in eternity?
Then said the shepherd boy,
In Lower Pomerania is the Diamond Mountain, which is 2.5 miles high, 2.5 miles wide, and 2.5 miles in depth. Every 100 years a little bird comes and sharpens its beak on it, and when the whole mountain is worn away by this, then the first second of eternity will be over.
The king said,
Thou hast answered the 3 questions like a wise man, and shalt henceforth dwell with me in my royal palace, and I will regard thee as my own child.
Confronted with the question of the number of water drops in the ocean, the shepherd boy displays not only confidence but also creativity. His answer demands cleverness and a special kind of reasoning, highlighting the importance of self-confidence and creativity. When dealing with the question of stars in the sky, the boy doesn't shy away. Instead, he utilizes the unpredictable beauty to demonstrate humility and admiration for the vastness and incomprehensible beauty of the universe. Responding to the inquiry about eternity, the shepherd boy presents a vivid, imaginative description using metaphorical language. The story underscores the power of imagination and language to depict abstract concepts. The narrative concludes with the boy being rewarded for his intelligence by living in the royal palace. This highlights the value of intelligence and problem-solving abilities in garnering attention and rewards. The story ends here. Have you learned valuable lessons through fairy tales? I will continue to bring other attractive fairy tales tomorrow. See you again. Bye-bye.